Hello everyone, my name is Yara and today I'm going to be doing another recent reads video. We got fantasy, we got romance, we got romantic fantasy, among other things. So without further ado, let's just get started. The first book I have is Mexican Gothic by Sylvia Moreno-Garcia. This takes place in 1950s Mexico and follows a young progressive socialite named Noemi Taboada after she receives an ominous letter from her newly married cousin Catalina, begging her to come save her from a mysterious doom. She talks about hearing voices and seeing images, and so Noemi decides to make the trek to the countryside to visit High Place, the estate owned by an English family that Catalina married into. There she finds Catalina supposedly ill, but Catalina's husband, Virgil Doyle, won't give Noemi any details, and more than that, Noemi comes to find that this estate is very rigid and cold, that Catalina's in-laws have very strict rules about what is and isn't to be done and where Noemi can go. Noemi's only ally in this place is Francis, the family's youngest son, but even he has some secrets that she seems to be holding back. Ultimately, Noemi is determined to figure out what is going on with this house and what is going on with her cousin. So this book has been out for a while now, and I've always seen it advertised as a gothic horror, and so I've always been a little bit wary of trying to read it because I don't read that much horror. But after reading this book, I realized that I have a very different imagining of what gothic horror is than maybe I thought before. Because when I think of horror, I think like scary movie horror. But that's not what this book is. At the end of the book, there's an interview with the author, and she kind of goes into what exactly is a gothic novel. And she defines it as romantic fiction with a prevailing atmosphere of suspense or terror, romantic being from the romantic artistic movement, not necessarily being a love story. Gothic novels usually have a focus on architecture and different aesthetic elements like the supernatural. But there are also more subcategories of Gothic novels that have developed, such as the female Gothic, which is popularized by the works of like the Bronte sisters and Anne Radcliffe and Mary Shelley. A lot of these books are focused on the female perspective as well as critiquing male power and male violence and abuse. So this novel definitely captures that idea of a gothic novel. Definitely don't go into it expecting it to be scary in like a modern sense. There's definitely still suspense and a feeling of being unsettled, but I wouldn't call it scary if that's something that you're concerned about. Going into the more bigger picture ideas about this book, this story really follows and critiques the idea of colonialism and eugenics. And the setting of High Place is a microcosm of that relationship. We learn a lot about the history of the Doyle family and how they moved from England to Mexico. A lot of times we associate the colonialism of Mexico with Spain, which is definitely true in a large part of their history. But what actually inspired Sylvia Moreno-Garcia to write this book was visiting an English cemetery that was kind of a microcosm of English colonialism in Mexico. So we learn a lot about the Doyle family's history, and specifically their business as owning the silver mines and the relationship with the local townfolk who they employed, how that affected the resources of the area as well as the economy and just the general relationship between the Europeans versus the locals. And this commentary is not something that is just kind of like a metaphor. Parts of it are, but a lot of it, especially the idea of eugenics, is explicit in the story, especially as the main character Noemi wants to study anthropology. Another interesting part of the story was how much medicine and science was involved, especially from a historical standpoint. Without giving too much away, tuberculosis and fungi play parts in this story. And on a personal note, that was very interesting to me because I was literally in my infectious disease unit when I was reading this book. So in the story, I'd be reading about different things about fungi, and I had just had a lecture about it like 2 days before, which was really wild and a really uncanny experience. There's also definitely a discussion about female hysteria and how historically women's complaints have been treated and have been dealt with, usually very unethically or not taken very seriously, as well as discussions of the differences between Western and local medicine. So ultimately, I really enjoyed reading this book. I think it's a pretty short book, but it did take a little bit of time for it to build, but I actually appreciated it because once we got to those really suspenseful parts, it made them feel all the more worth it. There is a little bit of a romance here if you're looking for that, which I thought was really cute. I hadn't read many Gothic novels outside of school, so I didn't really know exactly what to expect, but I definitely enjoyed the aesthetic of this and what Sylvia Moreno-Garcia was trying to portray, and I ultimately gave it 4 stars. The next 2 books I have, I'm going to talk about together because they are part of a duology, and it might be one of my favorite fantasy series of all time now. Is that too dramatic to say? But I think it's true. But that is A River Enchanted and A Fire Endless by Rebecca Ross. I don't really know what the series is called. I just call it the River Enchanted series. I feel like Rebecca Ross kind of like sprung to fame recently. I've been seeing people talk about her books so often, and so I saw these were available on Hoopla, so I just on a whim decided to read them because I was in the mood for fantasy. And that was the best decision that I could have made because I am obsessed with this series now. This follows Jack Tamerlane, who as a child was sent off to the mainland to study music at university. Now, 10 years later, he is summoned back to his home isle of Cadence after hearing word that several young girls in his community have been disappearing. In this world, everything is influenced by the world of the spirits, the folk of the air, the water, the earth, and the fire, and they only respond to the call of a bard's music. This is the reason that Adira, the heiress of Cadence and also Jack's childhood enemy, decides to call upon him and see if he can get word to the spirits to figure out where these girls are going and if the spirits can return them. In the process, though, they discover that there may be more deeper issues at hand. I'm putting these books back here now because they're kind of heavy. So, as I said before, I absolutely adored this duology. It was exactly what I needed in that moment. It kind of got me back into reading fantasy, and it captured me in a way that I haven't been captured by fantasy in a while. This series is largely inspired by Scottish folktale, both in the content and mythology of the world, as well as in the writing style and how the story is told. I don't even know how to describe it, but Rebecca Ross writes in such a way that is so perfect for a novel that is like a folktale. There is a fluidity to it, there is a poetry to it, but that is very subtle. I think the fact that the world in this story is pretty insular, at least what we see of it, kind of contributes to this idea of a folktale because we really only get to know about this one Isle of Cadence. We don't really know much else about the mainland or what else is going on in the world. We are very much focused on this island and what their history is. But while the world is kind of limited to this island, I think we get a lot of world building into the history of Cadence, which was really interesting to explore. We gradually get to learn more about how Cadence was divided into two kingdoms that have a very tumultuous past and have been warring ever since. It talks about the idea of how there can be two different versions of the same history depending on who is telling the story and whose perspective we are seeing, and how those prevailing perspectives change and develop over time and how they influence the political dynamics of the current time that we are witnessing. We also gradually learn more about the relationship of Cadence to the spirit world and the fair folk, both how it has been in the past as well as how it has changed. So I really did enjoy the world and the atmosphere of this series, but what really made me love it were the characters. Jack is technically our main character, but I would say that there are four core main characters that we follow. There's Jack that we discussed, there's Adira, who's the heiress, there's Torin, who is Adira's cousin as well as captain of the guard, and then there's Sidra, who is Torin's wife. They all have different dynamics with each other and different things that they bring out with one another. That was really fun to read. I love that Jack was not a kind of stereotypical leading man. He wasn't a fighter or a soldier or anything. His strength was a much softer one. It was in his music and his love of the artistry. He also has a really nice personal journey of not really feeling like he is accepted anywhere or really belongs somewhere, and learning to find home in where he is. And I love how this is also explored with his relationship with Adira, who is also going through a lot as she takes on more responsibility as heiress to this kingdom, which she doesn't necessarily feel ready to. Torin and Sidra honestly offered a really interesting perspective and a unique kind of relationship that I personally don't read a lot about because I read a lot of YA, which is usually about first loves, or at least about building a relationship from scratch. But Torin and Sidra are actually more of a rekindling kind of relationship. They basically got married out of convenience for what they both needed at the time. There wasn't really this idea of love. However, through the story, you gradually see what they both value, whether or not they can be compatible, and how they work that out, and how they grow to find love with each other, which is a really beautiful storyline. As you might have guessed from how I've been describing this book, this is definitely a more romantic style of fantasy, but it's not romantasy, which is definitely a important distinction to make, because if you are looking for romantasy, I don't think you're gonna find it in this series. As in, it doesn't have like the genre conventions of a romance in a fantasy setting, but rather a fantasy that features a lot of romantic elements, which for me worked out perfect. This is the perfect amount of blend that I wanted. So obviously 5 stars to both of them. They are great. You should read them. They are fantastic. Speaking of romance though, the next book that I have is People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry. Now this was also a pretty significant moment for me because it was my first Emily Henry book. Even more so than Rebecca Ross, Emily Henry has been extremely hyped up for me. And I'm not really a romance genre girly, I just haven't really read that much. but I figured that Emily Henry was probably a good place to try to get into it because I've heard that her books more so lean into the contemporary than the romance aspect, though obviously they all are still romance. But I chose to read People We Meet on Vacation first because I was on vacation. So this is about Alex and Poppy, who couldn't be more opposite. Poppy is really extroverted, she's really social, she likes going out and traveling, and Alex is kind of a more introverted, by-the-book kind of guy. Despite this, they've been best friends for years after they decided to carpool back to their hometown with one another after their first year of college. Even though over the years they lived in different places, with Alex staying in his hometown and working as an English teacher and Poppy moving to New York to work as a travel journalist, they always make time every summer to go on a vacation with one another. That is until 2 years prior to the start of the novel, where something happened that completely shattered the foundation of their relationship and they don't speak anymore. At the beginning of this novel, Poppy finds herself in a bit of a rut, both in her personal life as well as her career, and she decides to ask Alex to go on one last vacation with her, hoping that they can just lay everything out on the table and hopefully rekindle their friendship, or it can mess it up even more. So, as I said, Emily Henry is a very hyped up author, and so I had very high expectations going into this book, and perhaps too high of expectations. I thought this was gonna change my life or something. And it didn't quite do that, but I still liked it. This book is like quintessential friends to lovers angst, which I know a lot of people don't like, and I actually recently learned that a lot of people think this is the worst Emily Henry book. I've only read one, so I can't really give my opinion, but let me know what you think if that is the case. But I really enjoy Friends to Lovers. I think it's really sweet, and I particularly like the way that Emily Henry did it. I think a lot of the issues with Friends to Lovers comes with the fact that a lot of times we don't get to see the parts of their friendship that make them like each other. We only see the part where they are older and have already had this kind of deep-seated love without them realizing it. But this book really tracks Alex and Poppy's friendship through the years, from the moment they met to the eventual incidents that happened in their 8th summer together. We get to see why their dynamic as friends work, why they enjoy each other's company, what they bring out from one another. We basically get to see the relationship build. Even if it's not a romantic one, it is their connection nonetheless. And I think that's why this really worked for me, as well as the fact that I just really enjoy Emily Henry's writing style, specifically her dialogue. I don't know if this is the case in all of her books, but she just has a really great way of writing wit and banter and people jumping off of each other and their points. On one side, it's just really fun and enjoyable to read, but on the other, it's also a really efficient way of getting to know these characters better. Where this book kind of lost a star for me was in what we eventually learned to be the big reveal of what happened between Alex and Poppy, because that is kept a secret for most of the novel. Without giving too much away, it was just kind of underwhelming, just given how much angst and emotional weight was given to it leading up to the reveal. It was just kind of like, that was the reason you guys didn't talk for 2 years? Maybe it's an outsider's bias. Maybe if I was in that situation, I would also react the way that Poppy and Alex did, but I don't know. It was just kind of like okay, that was it. I think it kind of ruined the momentum of the story I had up until that point, but otherwise, it's definitely a very solid romance book. It was so fun. It was so cute. I definitely recommend reading it when you're on vacation. It was the perfect book for that. And I'm looking forward to reading more of Emily Henry's books. The last book I have is Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. This is a retelling of the Greek myth of Ariadne, who is the princess of Crete. She is the one who helped Theseus through the labyrinth and allowed him to fight and kill the Minotaur. And the cultural conception of this myth obviously doesn't really center Ariadne, and so Jennifer Saint decided to write the book about her story, and specifically all of the women in this myth around Theseus. We explore her upbringing as a princess of Crete. We explore how the Minotaur came to be as her half-brother and the effect that had on her family. We see how she is swept away by Theseus's charm and promises in ways that completely upend her life. We also spend some time with her sister Phaedra, who stays in Crete after Ariadne goes off with Theseus. As a Percy Jackson Greek mythology girl, I obviously had to read this book, but in particular, I wanted to read this book because Ariadne's story is actually mentioned in the Percy Jackson series and plays a pretty small but important role in the 3rd book, in The Titan's Curse. Dionysus basically tells Percy why he doesn't trust demigod heroes by using the story of Theseus and Ariadne, and I absolutely loved the role that story played in Percy Jackson, so I really was excited to get a whole book about it. And maybe similarly to Emily Henry, I think I just had a little bit too high of expectations going into this book that I was undoubtedly going to be a little bit underwhelmed. When I finished this book, it was really hard for me to pinpoint exactly how I felt about it, other than the fact that I did enjoy it, I did like it, but I guess I was expecting it to be more than what it was. The writing was good, but also simple in a way that perhaps maybe didn't connect with me as much as it could have. I definitely recognized and appreciated what Jennifer Saint was trying to do with this story, and definitely got the effect of how much Ariadne and Phaedra and all the women in this family, how much their lives were influenced by the men around them, particularly negatively, how even the people that you thought would support you could betray you, and what that betrayal can lead you to do. Alexa, play History of Man by Macy Peters. But no, seriously, that's basically what this book is like in a song. So yeah, I give it 3.5 stars. That's pretty much the rating that I give any book that I'm like, I liked it, but I can't really articulate why I didn't like it, so I don't want to commit to the solid 3 stars, but also I don't want to give it the 4 stars. So those were all the books that I have for today. Please let me know if you read any of them, what your thoughts were, if you're interested in reading any of them. Please let me know a book that you are currently reading, and if you have any recommendations for me and what I should check out. If you like my content, please like, comment, and subscribe. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye.